Hi, I'm Pastor Joel Rothe with Resurrection Lutheran Church. Thanks for tuning in to our worship video for this week. We are in the middle of transitioning our recording system to a full live stream system. So very soon you'll be able to view our worship services live on Sunday morning at the time in which they take place, and that those services will then be recorded and available anytime after those services. While we are implementing this new system, it's requiring more time and energy from our staff. And so we're abbreviating our recorded worship services for these next few weeks as we get ready for this new system to come into place. We thank you for your graciousness and understanding as we limit the amount of content in these videos, but we hope that the music, the gospel reading, and the preaching from these videos will sustain you for this week ahead. May God's peace be with you.
If I speak with the tongues of men and angels, but have not love, I am just noise.
according to John, the 21st chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. After he appeared to his followers in Jerusalem, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." They said to him, "We will go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but his disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there, with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the 3rd time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the 3rd time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he said to him the 3rd time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After this, he said to him, "Follow me." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Please be seated. Well, grace and peace to you in the name of the risen Christ. As human beings, as people, and within our culture, we oftentimes use the things that we do with our hands, our work, as our identity. As we try to tell people who we are and what we're about, we oftentimes will share about our profession or our vocation. And that's not always a bad thing, because for many of us, when we find that right sweet spot and niche between the things that we're passionate about, the gifts that we have received from God to use in our lives, and we're able to use them in a way in our work that makes a difference in the lives and in the lives of others and in the world, that vocation gives us deep meaning and deep purpose. It's not just something that we do, it's something that we are. But oftentimes, at different points in our lives, what we do for our work and our vocation can lead us into places of struggling with our identity. of just who it is when those things don't come together to create more meaning or purpose for us. And there's many different parts and times in our lives that those things may happen. In both my previous congregation and here within this congregation, we have quite a few people in our community that are retired. And I don't say that in any type of negative way. It's a reality of who we are. But one thing I've learned as a younger person that still has many years to go before retirement is even talked about, is that retirement is one of those places that can sometimes lead to a little bit of a crisis of identity when our identity is so deeply rooted in what we do. Because at that point in our lives, we've taken a lifetime worth of work, and all of a sudden we stop, and we step out away from it, and we ask questions of ourselves that says, well, now that I am not doing this with a significant amount of my energy and time on a day-to-day basis, who am I? What am I? How do I make meaning or purpose on a regular basis when my work no longer is that thing that gives me that marker of my identity? Is that resonant with anybody that's gone through retirement? I don't see many heads nodding, but the little murmuring and sort of uneasy laughter tells me I think all I need to know. But it's not just retirement where these things happen, right? There's other markers along the way in our journey where when our identity is connected with our vocation or our profession, that we sometimes encounter these phases of identity questioning and sometimes even crisis. When we lose a job that defined who we are. When a job is sometimes taken away from us, or sometimes even when we feel that nudging to say, I need to go try something else or do something else, can lead to those moments. Perhaps it's even within a job, but we experience a really significant failure. A failure that leads to you believing or questioning who I am or what am I doing in this life. Or perhaps when our identity is tied to our vocation or profession and the world looks down upon that particular vocation or profession. Or perhaps you are ridiculed or treated as less than because of your work, can also lead to those moments of wondering, who am I? Who am I supposed to be? What am I supposed to do? We encountered the disciples today in John's Gospel, in this final chapter of the Gospel, in the midst of this moment for themselves, as the risen Christ appears to them this third time. Because we find them following Peter back out to go fishing. And it's there that we have to recall where their story in the Gospels begins. The same place that it ends here in this chapter, with fishing. Many of these disciples, fishermen, the act of fishing was not just a recreational sport, it was their work, it was their profession, and for some of them, it was the vocation that had been handed down to them from their father, and likely their father's father and father's father before that. That their identity was held in this act of fishing. That is where they would have been recognized in their culture as their place. But for these disciples at this point in the story, we know that they had a radical moment in their life of going through an identity change when they said yes to Jesus. When they encountered something in this person that sparked them to saying, I'm going to put down my nets, and I'm going to step out of the boat, and I'm going to follow Jesus into this movement of love and inclusion and healing and finding life for people and communities. They were called to be something more than fishermen. and they let something in their identity go to be able to live into this new identity that they were following Jesus into. But then we know that it didn't stop there for them as they followed Jesus, and then they have these moments at the very end where they see Jesus dying on a cross. They had to have been wondering in their hearts and minds, is this the end? Is this the end of what I gave my life to? Is all of this movement just going to go away? What does this mean for who I am supposed to be and what I'm supposed to do from this point going forward? And for many of them, it likely was not just a crisis of identity, it was a crisis of failure, specifically for Peter, right? Because Peter gave himself to Jesus, and then at the end, goes back on everything that he said and proclaimed that he was going to be when he denies Jesus 3 times. And so can you blame those disciples and Peter himself for saying, in the midst of wondering what comes next, what am I to be and what am I to do, that they would then go back to what was most familiar for them? That they would go back to that previous identity. They would go back simply to fishing. And that's not necessarily a bad thing for them. They had to go back and find out how they were going to provide for themselves. Perhaps they even went out there that day out of necessity to say, how can we make a little bit of money because we don't know what comes next for us? But we know in this story from John's Gospel, it's there that they experience another failure. They put their nets on the side of the boat, and what happens? Nothing. Precisely nothing. Even in the midst of their previous vocation, they have this moment where Jesus says, you don't have any fish in there, do you? Another marker that says, what you once were is no longer what I am calling you to be. Because what happens next is all about what Jesus does. Jesus gives them some instruction on what to do to catch some fish, and then Jesus calls them in with his love back to a meal that they were probably quite familiar with, a meal that they had been a part of in countless occasions through Jesus' ministry, where they would gather together for bread and for fish and for conversation with one another, as Jesus taught and shared messages with people that reminded them deeply of where their identity truly was held, which was not in their work, not in their profession or vocation or smaller identities, but Jesus always around tables of people reminded one another that the identity that they are to carry with them dwells in God, abides in God's radical love and grace and mercy. And that there is no identity that the world can give that can separate us, or those disciples, from God's love that gives them meaning and purpose in their lives. Not even death itself, as it is the resurrected Christ that gathers them in that space. And for us as disciples, for us as human beings, we hold on to that promise ourselves, that when we ourselves are struggling to find meaning or find purpose at any point or juncture in our lives, we remember that all of the smaller identities, our work, the measures of who we are as people, all of those things pale in comparison to the identity we receive when God calls us child of God, dearly beloved. Then the story proceeds from that place of grace and inclusion and nourishment. And we encounter this really intimate moment between Peter and Jesus. Now, certainly in this encounter, this is a moment of forgiveness for Peter. It's modeled after those 3 denials earlier in the gospel that Peter offers. And then Jesus comes back 3 times again and asks Peter, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? But it's more than forgiveness. It's more than just reconciling their relationship. What Jesus is doing in conversation with Peter after this meal is helping Peter discern and figure out what comes next for him. Who he is to be, what he is to do. Because certainly Peter would have been tempted to give it all up and just go back to fish. But Jesus says, do you love me? Not as a personal question, but as a marker of what Peter is called to be, which is a lover. A lover. That's what all of the disciples were called to be. That's what we are called to be. Throughout John's gospel, that's the message that Jesus pours out. It doesn't matter where you've come from or what you do, you are called to love one another as I have loved you. Is that not the pinnacle of Jesus' moment at the Last Supper in John's Gospel when he washes the disciples' feet and says, I give you a new commandment to love one another as I have loved you. Jesus calls us to be lovers. Strange term, isn't it? We don't think about love in that way all of the time. But if we think even about Paul, who is in our first reading today, what is it that Paul says when he says, if I have not love in anything that I do, I am nothing? Or even that I'm a clanging gong or a noisy cymbal. In all things, beyond our specific work or task, we are called to love. Think about that for the church. Don't we lose our way in our identity from time to time? We get too focused on simply the acts of worship, or the ministries of the church, or the business administration, and looking over the bottom line of the budget, or taking care of the building or the property. But if we do all of these things and we have not love, what are we? We're nothing. At the heart of what it means to be the church, we are called to be lovers. And to allow that to be central to our identity in Christ, and to allow that to be our identity as the church. A community of lovers in the world. But that's not just a generic term, because Jesus goes on 3 different times and says there's something you have to do if you're going to be a lover. Feed my lambs. Tend my sheep. Feed my sheep. Feed those people that I love. Tend to those people whom I love. Which is all people. And we know that Peter takes up that challenge. He takes up that vocation of lover and goes forth to live that, even giving his own life like Jesus through his own ministry. But for us as the church, it's an ongoing question of discernment. How do we love? How do we love the risen Christ, and how do we love our neighbors? And it's there that I have a final image that has stuck with me for some years, going back to my time in Columbus, Ohio, where I went to seminary. Just like Portland, Oregon, Columbus had many different intersections around town where there were often people who were asking for money, or for food, or for help. And oftentimes, as is true, here in Portland, people would have signs. Sometimes they would be creative, sometimes they would be basic, just asking for something. But there was one person in particular that I had a chance to see in Columbus that has stuck with me. And I feel ashamed in a way because I don't know this person's name. I didn't stop to have a conversation or even offer anything. But this person held up a sign that simply had the same words that Jesus asked Peter. Do you love me? Do you love me? Perhaps that's where the risen Christ is showing up to us. In the least and the lost, those who are in need, those people who Jesus through his ministry deeply loved. And perhaps that's the call for us as lovers to discern. How specifically and tangibly in the lives of people who are in need do we love? Do we feed? Do we care? May the love of Christ that meets us right where we are send us forth into the world to love and to serve. God's peace be with you. Amen.
Lord, whose love in humble service bore the weight of human need, who upon the cross forsaken worked your mercy's perfect deed. We, your servants, bring the worship, not a voice alone but heart, consecrating to your purpose every gift which you still your children wander homeless, still the hungry cry for bread, still the captives long for freedom, still in grief we mourn our dead. As you, Lord, in deep compassion, healed the sick and freed the soul, by your Spirit send your power to our world to make it whole. As we worship, grant us vision till your love's revealing light, in its height and depth and greatness, dawns upon our quickened sight, making known the needs and burdens your compassion bids us bear, stirring us to ardent service, your abundant life to share. Called by worship to your service, forth in your